Thank you for joining us. This is the Vital Masculinity Podcast, and my name is Brian. I've got some bad news and some good news. The bad news is that our giveaway is over, and you probably are not the winner. That is, unless your name is Matthew, in which case, it is good news, because you won! Congratulations, Matthew. Soon you'll have a brand new copy of Mansfield's Book of Manly Men on your doorstep. Everyone else, you'll have to stay tuned for our next giveaway. In the meantime, why don't you head on over to our Vital Masculinity Facebook group and join the discussion. Speaking of discussion, this week Stephen and I talk about practicing prudence. I know you guys have been waiting for this one, so I won't hold you up any longer. Let's get down to practicing prudence.
Welcome to the Vital Masculinity Podcast. I am your host, Stephen Sloyer, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Brian Murphy. How you doing today, man?
I'm doing really good. I'm excited about this episode. I think it's going to be a good one.
We're talking about prudence again, but this is the last episode on prudence, and we think it's going to be a great one. As always, before we jump right into the content, we got a couple of very quick announcements. First, please check out our website if you have not already, vitalmasculinity.org. There you can find show notes, links to other resources that we think will help you become a better man, and you can hear about our story about becoming better men ourselves, because we're all on this journey together. The second thing is we'd love for you to join our conversation and agree or disagree with what we've been saying on these past couple of episodes over at Facebook. You can find a link there on our website that I just mentioned, or you can go to Facebook and search Vital Masculinity. It shouldn't be too hard to find. The last thing, as cliche as ever, is we would love for you to leave a rating and a review. If you really find this content helpful, it's helpful to spread the message, because there's a lot of men out there that are struggling. And honestly, we want to hear good feedback, or we want to hear bad feedback too. We want to hear any feedback. So if you have comments, if you have suggestions, if you have criticism, then please, put it wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you really find this helpful, then like it and subscribe it and share with other people, because that's how we help other men become good, noble, and more complete men. But anyway, Brian, what are we talking about tonight?
We are talking about practicing prudence. So the last couple episodes, we talked about misconceptions of prudence, prerequisites of prudence, and now we're going to kind of focus on the more tangible, okay, how can I do this type of thing?
Yeah, and that's really important. And, one caveat as we begin, we mentioned before that prudence isn't just, a list of things you look over and you do. It's unfortunately not just a checklist, because it's unfortunately not that easy. We really want you to begin to internalize this sense of prudence, this sense of thinking wisely and acting wisely thereafter in a very timely manner.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we can kind of start off with something that we've went over a number of different times. What exactly does it look like to take a prudent action? So no matter what situation it is, and this is actually something that we should be doing in every situation. So first off, we want to assess, okay, what is the good thing to be doing here? What's the right thing to be doing? We kind of look and take in what's going on, and then after that, we're going to make a judgment. Okay, I've decided this is what the right thing to do is right now in this place with what's happening, and then I'm going to act decisively. So assess the situation, make a judgment, and then act decisively. And that's kind of the short version of what it looks like to act prudently.
Yeah, and for those listening, these 3 steps, quote unquote, these are very similar to the OODA Loop, the OODA Loop that was made famous by Air Force Colonel John Boyd, which stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. And really, what John Boyd put together is just practical decision-making in an Air Force setting, which honestly applies to all of our lives, which is why we're sitting here talking to you about these steps.
Right, exactly. So something that's very kind of applies to our situation right now, we are recording this podcast, and Stephen and I both decided, well, it's prudent for us to sit down tonight to record this podcast so that we can share this with you. So that's the prudent thing, the prudent choice that we have made today.
Yeah, absolutely. And prudence doesn't need to be grand gestures. Prudence can be done in these simple things, as in planning and actually, taking control of your day-to-day activities, your life, and so on. It doesn't need to be these grand gestures at all.
Right. So if we're thinking about being prudent men, it's something that we really have to apply throughout our day, every day. So it's not just something that happens in certain situations, but it's something that's we should always be doing. If we want to be prudent, we have to be prudent all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the first ways, actually, I will say the first way, this is step number one, quote unquote, in becoming a more prudent man for those that are listening, and that is we need to seek the counsel of wiser men. Brian, I know you don't say you have all the answers. I certainly don't say I have all the answers, and that's why I think you and I have gotten, along so well over the years, is because we've really kind of not just encouraged each other to become better men, but we've really shared our wisdom that we've gained over the course of our very different lives. And not just, going between each other. We've learned from our parents, we've learned from friends, from mentors at work. And this is very important because we honestly do not have all the answers. And we would not be sitting here with you if we had all the answers, because then we'd just be writing a book and telling you what to do. We're on this journey with you guys, and that's why we need the counsel of wiser men.
Right. That brings up a good point. So prudence is something that is kind of hard won. You can't just normally it just isn't something that just happens magically. You have to put in the work. You have to learn important things, learn what's the right thing to do, learn how to approach certain situations. And that might be through learning from other men. It might be just observing the world. It could be reading a book. There's all sorts of ways you can do it. But it takes a lot of work. It's not something that, you just wake up and you're born acting prudent.
Yeah. And going on this concept of work, and as well as on this concept of seeking the counsel of people that are wiser than you, I think we live in a very fractured and atomized age where, we don't live in the tight-knit communities that our ancestors may have. So I think a lot of you may be saying, well, I don't have a band of brothers, which is a concept that's talked about a lot, in Art of Manliness and Order of Man and a bunch of other places. And that's very well and good, but a lot of people just don't have them right now. And if you're in a place where you don't have, people that can really call you out or give you sage advice, one of the best places to start, honestly, is in reading the lives of people that are much wiser than you. Autobiographies and biographies are very important, first of all, because they're books about people. They're not books about concepts that are trying to be sold to you, but also because, there's so many great examples out there from people in America, the presidents, people you would typically think of like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and so on, to people, going back to the saints. We have centuries of material, of wisdom that you can really learn from if you take the time that Brian's saying and actually put in the work to reading and kind of digesting this material.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about reading biographies. If we're looking to be virtuous men, if we're looking to build a band of brothers, we have to know what that looks like. And if we don't already have that, and I'm guessing most of us don't, because we're probably here looking for that, or at very least we're looking to kind of build upon what we already have, we need to learn from the past. We need to learn from other men. We need to learn from men of history. And by doing that, by understanding what it looks like to be a virtuous man, by looking at other men's lives, either now or in the past, we'll be able to find men who will actually be proud to say these are men that are part of my band of brothers.
Absolutely. And that's very important, is, we don't want to just be stuck in books. Hopefully you're in a position and a place in your life that you will be able to find men that are similar to you and that are like-minded, that want to become better men themselves, that you can encourage each other and all that stuff. But, that's the end goal at the very least. And talking about biographies, one of the things that I learned, which I think brings to a good second point about practicing prudence and about how you men out there can actually practice prudence, is the idea of reflection. And I've read so many biographies from Benjamin Franklin to Theodore Roosevelt, and you talk about one of the main themes that goes through all of them is that they were journalers. They wrote and they kept a record of their thoughts and their actions every day, and they would reflect on them, actually. It wasn't just a logbook like you would find on a ship. These people were actually saying, okay, these are the things that I did, so how can I do them better tomorrow? And that's a very important part of prudence, is because this is where you assess and you make a judgment. Whether it's in the morning, right as you wake up, or in the evening, in your evening routine, right before you're going to bed, you kind of need to have this period of reflection and digestion about your actions, your thoughts, your feelings, and so on, so you can go ahead the next day or later in the day, if it's the morning, and actually act decisively.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because if you think about the way our culture works today, especially with news and social media, like everyone's focusing on, okay, we got to be on top of this story. We got to be the first one to break the story. We got to be the first one to share this on Facebook so I can get all the likes. And that's kind of training us to not reflect on things, kind of just, vomit all the ideas that are in our head. And I don't know about you, but usually the first idea that comes to my mind is not really one that's well formed and needs some work.
Yeah. As men, we should not be slaves to our feelings or our thoughts. We should always make sure that whatever comes into our head, just in the same way we make sure whatever comes into our body is actually something that's good for us. We don't want the Burger Kings and the McDonald's of foods or of thoughts just kind of floating around in our heads all day, because that will direct our lives, because our thoughts do guide and decide the type of lives that we have. And acting on them in many ways can be catastrophic. So keeping a good watch and making sure you don't immediately accept and act on whatever comes into your head, whether it's because you're on Facebook all the time or whether you're watching the news, that's really important. And actually, I'll put a caveat to all this and say you should probably not spend all your time on Facebook. You should probably not watch the news. Actually, not even should, just don't do that. Don't spend all your time watching the news. Don't spend all your time on Facebook. And make sure you take some time for solitude, because solitude's an important part of reflection. Brian, I know you are a journaler and you do some reflection. When you get ready to do that, do you just go immediately from like 100 miles an hour, whether it's work or the gym or something else, and then, immediately over into that? Or do you kind of need some time to kind of wind down and gather your thoughts, right?
Yeah, that's totally true. I mean, you're coming home from work or whatever it might be, and it's a long day, a lot of things going on, and a lot of times you just need some time to, relax, clear your mind, so that you can think more clearly. I have a specific example actually from a couple days ago. My girlfriend and I were trying to talk about another virtue, chastity, and kind of setting some boundaries, reassessing the boundaries that we've set to kind of make sure that we're, living this virtue of chastity. And we kind of talked about it a little bit in the morning. We were texting, or I think we might have had breakfast over Skype or something like that. But so we kind of talked about it a little bit, and I forget exactly what it was, but I had one. So after we talked about it, we weren't really sure what we wanted to do. We were going to think about it. So I thought about it for 10, 15 minutes. I was like, oh, I have a great idea. And I could have just sent her a text right away, but I was like, no, I'll wait. And so I thought about it more throughout the day, and then I had another idea, and I was like, oh, this is even better. And it was almost the exact opposite of what I thought earlier. And then by the time I thought about it a little bit more, it kind of matured even more, and so it was like somewhere in between. So, and if I would have just, it's very easy to send a text message, and I think that's another thing that that's another challenge today is, we're all used to texting, and that's kind of made our communication very instant and doesn't include a lot of reflection. So one of the challenges is to, if you have something important to talk about, especially, you don't want to just send it right away, the first thing that, sounds good to you. Give yourself some time to think it over, and that applies to journaling, that applies to, anything you're trying to process. Like, you need time, and even if it seems like it's a great idea to begin with, you might realize later that there's some more to it that you have to really think through.
Absolutely. Oh my, excuse me. Yeah, and that brings us another good point. We really do need to pause and reflect before our actions, particularly actions or conversations, like in Brian's instance, that are new to us. We don't want to be impulsive, and we don't just want to say the first thing that comes to mind, as we've kind of been saying, because in areas that we've not, yet navigated, in conversations we've not yet had, like in Brian's instance, in topics we may not have exactly thought about, we're very prone to errors. And prudence still has that wisdom aspect about it, where we can't just jump headfirst into every opportunity. We kind of need to assess where we are. And while we don't want to just, want to sit back and deliberate for hours and hours and hours, if it's a decision that requires you to make a snap judgment, but there is that kind of fine line about deciding the urgency of the problem at hand, or the conversation or topic at hand, and then deciding exactly what your next steps are, whether it's something you need to deliberate, like in Brian's instance, or whether it's something that may require a immediate response, like in the event of like triage, like you were mentioning before the show, Brian.
Right. So actually, before we get on to that, I just want to mention one more thing. And
Sure.
I think the point you bring up about communication is really key, because it's important for us to reflect about everything. But if we think about communication, that's something that we're talking with another person, or writing or texting or whatever it might be, and we're sharing our thoughts, especially if it's really important, like that needs some reflection to, be respectful to the other person, so that we're communicating clearly and decisively, especially when it comes to women. Because if I would have told my girlfriend, okay, I think we should do this, and then 2 hours later I said, well, no, actually, we shouldn't do that, we should do this, and then couple hours after that I would have said the exact, something else, she would have been so confused and, upset and frustrated. And, when you're trying to, especially in a romantic relationship as a man, you're trying to, lead the woman and be the man of the relationship. You don't want to come across as confused or not confident. So it's really important that you think through those things.
Right. And I'll be honest, Brad, in many instances, a woman like that would have probably thought of, less of you as a man. And that should, in some senses, be shameful, which is why we're here talking to you about how you avoid those scenarios. Because men should be decisive. Men should consider consequences. They should pause and reflect. And all of these may kind of sound like they don't belong together, being decisive, yet pausing and reflecting, yet there's scenarios and there's times for everything. In Brian's case, he should not have just made a snap judgment, because it could have come back and haunted him. And one of the things that I do want to say as well before we move on, Brian, is that, a lot of these things that you and I are talking about, they may kind of sound weird. As I said, decisiveness and pausing and reflecting, and the fine line between, when you do one, when you do the other, in a sense, like, a lot of this just comes with experience. If you're a man that's, out there, and for instance, you never talked to a woman, let alone asked one out, and you want to ask the girl at the coffee shop out, the only way you're going to actually be able to successfully do that is if you go ahead, man up, and do it. You're not, all the books you read, all the people you talk to, all of these things, unless you actually have that action, it's not going to happen. Other times, you really do just need to, just take the leap and acquire that experience in order for you to better understand future times that you may encounter, such an obstacle. I'm trying to think of some examples off the top of my head. I don't know if you have any, Brian.
Yeah, I was just thinking, so if you go back to like the coffee shop example, maybe you don't have a lot of experience approaching women, or asking them out on a date, or even just talking to them. If you don't have the experience, you're not gonna have a lot to work on. But the one prudent thing you can do is say, well, I need this experience. I need to learn how to talk to women, and that starts by starting a conversation. So the prudent thing you can do is actually start a conversation. Maybe you don't know all the specifics about, what I should say or what I shouldn't say or what we should talk about, but that's kind of what's built into prudence. You have to kind of act on the knowledge that you have in that moment. And if you don't have a whole lot of knowledge, well, at least that you want to talk to the girl. So the prudent thing to do is to actually talk to her.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And those are all good things to consider. So moving on a little bit, one of the things that I think comes up when we're talking about like preparation for being prudent or making prudent and wise decisions is, we talk about learning, we talk about reflection, getting advice from other people. One of the things that comes up as well is visualization. Now, Brian, what's your take on visualization?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times you hear visualization, especially when it comes to things like sports. You hear athletes, if they're playing baseball, like they're visualizing their swing. Maybe it's an important game, it's the bottom of the ninth inning, tie game or something like that. They're visualizing, they go up there and they hit a home run or something like that. So they're visualizing like what they want to do, how they're gonna respond in certain situations, and this kind of can apply to everything. So like go back to the coffee shop example. What do I want to do? I want to talk to this girl. Maybe I don't know what to say, but I can visualize myself going up to her, saying, "Hi, I'm Brian. How you doing?" Something like that. I don't know. It doesn't have to be complicated. A lot of times, the more you can kind of overthink it, but the point to visualization is like, think about, what's going to happen? What am I going to do? Based on the knowledge that I have of the situation, what should I do and how should I act? And that's kind of what it is, I guess.
Yeah. One other thing that I think is important when we're talking about prudence, and I'll say virtue in general, this kind of underlies the entire experiment, about becoming better men in a sense. And that is always keeping your end goals in mind. One of the things that is important, and this has come up in all the examples we've given, is that, in the coffee shop example, since I think that's such a great example, you would never ask that girl out if you aren't thinking that, well, you'd like to be in a relationship with her, or you'd like to get to know her better, or you'd like to get married someday. You never think about being prudent or practicing prudence or practicing visualization unless you're thinking that you need to be prudent or that you want to become a better man. And those are things that I think we lose sight of very often. It's very easy to kind of wake up to immediately check, your email or Twitter or whatever it may be, and to just kind of go through the day very unfocused in a very foggy manner and just live your life. I don't even want to say in an average manner, just to live your life, because honestly, it's depressing. I've lived a life like that at times, and it makes me literally depressed. And I don't want that for you gentlemen. And luckily, so many other people have had this experience, but really, I think the key takeaway from a lot of these examples is that you need to be constantly reminding yourself about what you want. We're not saying that you need to visualize, if you want to be a millionaire, you don't visualize yourself with $1 million, none of that, new age bunk. But because visualization isn't entirely bad. Visualization, in the way Brian was mentioning before, is actually very helpful. Sports is again a great example for where it's commonly used.
Right. But I think, especially going back to this coffee shop example, or really any example, the key is, okay, maybe you want to get married and have 12 kids or whatever it is, but you're trying to talk to this girl at the coffee shop, so you got to start like with a plan and go step by step. And the first step is to talk to her. So maybe you have this long-term goal, but ultimately you have to kind of chunk it out and not just say, "Hey, do you want to have 12 kids?" It's not going to work that way. you have to have like mini
step
goals.
One.
Yeah.
Right. You can't skip from step 1 to step 30. As much as I wish that were the case, but And, you know, one of the other things, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, we talked about this before, is decisiveness. And that, I think, is really the last step to being prudent, is to being decisive in the moment. If you're up there in line waiting for your coffee, and typically you've said nothing to that girl, you know, now's your time to act. Now's your time to go ahead and say, you know, hi, what's your name? Or, hey, I thought you were cute. You know, whatever it may be. And as we did prep for this show, I've thought a lot about, maybe we'll do an actual full show about decisiveness because that's something that's so important, not a lot of men have it. But Brian, I think you may agree with me. Honestly, you just have to go out there and do it. Like, there's nothing really else to talk about being decisive. There's not really a trick. It's just kind of about getting over that fear. And we can talk about fears and other things like that may be holding you back. But being decisive is just going and doing it. It's kind of, you know, manning up, picking up your waist, like in an old-fashioned cartoon, and going and taking care of the problem. Or in this case, asking the girl on a date.
Right. And I think there might be a small trick, though, because a lot of times we think of decisiveness and, like, it's a big challenge. Like, I don't want to do this. I'm freaking out. I'm scared. I'm anxious about talking to her. But I think that's where prudence comes in and I guess decisiveness is part of prudence. But if we're assessing a situation, we're making a judgment. And really the key that we kind of talked about is, you know, splitting up into small goals. So maybe if you have no experience with this, your goal is to just say hi to her and see what happens from there. So if you say hi, you've accomplished your goal. Wow, you've assessed the situation. You decided you wanted to say hi, and you did it. And whatever happens after that is you know, it doesn't really matter.
And this is why you have a band of brothers, because you can learn tricks like this from each other. Thanks for sharing, Brian. Now, was there anything else you wanted to touch on when we're talking about, like, actually practicing prudence?
I mean, we could talk about maybe some different examples, but
Sure. Let's wrap up the show with that. That's always a good way to finish a show.
Yeah, so we kind of talked about more practical examples, and, you know, some people will split prudence into, like, two types, where it's natural prudence and supernatural prudence. And as Christians, like, this supernatural prudence is something that we kind of have to take into mind as well. I don't know if everyone is listening is a believer or not, but there's kind of you know, there's two different levels here, because we can often think of prudence as, you know, just being practical, and that's certainly true to an extent, but ultimately prudence comes down to recognizing what is true to reality and acting in a way which is right and good. And sometimes that might not look practical to other people if they don't understand why we're making the choices we are.
Absolutely. And this kind of gets back even to the point of, you know, what's your goal? Why do you live your life the way you do? What is the purpose of your life? You know, I think a great example that you would agree with, Brian, is the concept of martyrdom. You know, from a purely, you know, I'll say worldly standpoint, martyrdom doesn't make any sense because you're literally dying. But from, you know, for like saints from the early era of Rome all the way to the martyrs, you know, of a couple of weeks ago, you know, it's a very, very easy decision because, you know, they orient their lives towards worshiping God and towards seeking communion with Him and all of these things. And martyrdom, dying for that belief, dying for their creator, you know, the creator of the universe, is something that's very natural. You know, from other people, they may say that's not prudent at all because you're dying, you got yada, yada, yada. There's so many things like that. But to them, it's very practical.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
I think that, you know, maybe if you're not a believer, you might not necessarily agree with that. But I think there's something about the man's soul, about the masculine soul, you know, things that all men desire, that search for, is to have a cause that is higher than themselves, something that, you know, is worth dying for.
Yeah, and here's another great example, which is very secular, that I'm sure a lot of men would agree with, and they'd probably face, you know, at least once in their life, and that is the fact that, you know, maybe you'll be at a job that's comfortable, that you're working a 9 to 5 or an 8 to 5, and pays well, and you have a family, a wife and 3 or 4 children at home, and you're able to see them on weekends and stuff, and then you get approached about a new job or a new position that will offer you, maybe the $30,000 more or whatever it may be, and you'll have to work, instead of 9 to 5 or 8 to 5, you'll work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And a lot of people reject that because they value their family more. But some people may say that's not prudent because you're missing out on $30,000 or whatever the benefits may be. A title, a car, a parking spot. There's so many things, and that's something to keep in mind. We don't want to. There's a lot of different ways that we can judge, prudent decisions, and that's why we like to kind of keep prudence to the assess, make a judgment, act decisively. We're not telling you how to make a judgment. Hopefully you'll make a wise judgment. A bad judgment would be a train's coming. I'm assessing the situation. There's a train's coming. I make a judgment to step out onto the tracks and oops, I acted and I got hit by a train. That's not a good judgment. The better judgment would be there's a train coming. I assess the situation. I take a step back. That's my action. So, but things like that, it kind of depends on how you look at these scenarios and these situations.
Right. I think maybe to wrap it up, we can just, look at what prudence is. It's about, recognizing what is the ultimate truth of reality and responding in a way that is true to that. So what is the right thing to do? What is the good thing to do? And that's something that we have to learn. We have to educate ourselves about. We have to search for that in our own lives. And once we have found that, and that's something that, you don't really reach an endpoint. That's something you're continually looking for, continually learning, what is true, what is good, what is right, how can I do this? And that's kind of part of prudence is we have to recognize these things, we have to search for these things, and then we have to act according to them.
I love that. I don't think I can add anything else to that. So I think we'll wrap up with that. Those wise words from Brian, which could be a segment. Wise words from Brian. So all of these concepts we've talked about in this show, as well as the past shows on prudence, you can find alongside the episodes on our site. So we're actually going to spell these out in our armory so that you men can have easy access and reminders about these things that we said, so you don't have to go searching through episodes and things like that. But in order to find that, you have to go to our website, vitalmasculinity.org. You'll also probably be able to find links at some point. I'm sure one of us will post them on our Facebook group. And you can join the conversation there about this podcast, this entire series on prudence, as well as future podcasts that are coming out on the other 3 cardinal virtues, because next week we are going to be talking about justice and beginning a series on that. That'll be fun because justice is so popular and so misunderstood. But anyway, Brian, what is the daily deed?
So we kind of talked a little bit about reflection, visualization. So I think maybe what we can do this time is at the end of every day, take 5 minutes to reflect on your day. Think about, where did I not act prudently? Where did I act prudently? And then kind of just determine for the next day, I'm going to work on this one thing. Pick one thing. Maybe you've been imprudent in a number of different situations, but pick one thing and say, tomorrow I'm going to work on that.
Love it. Now, and I'll add to that and say, make sure you write it down. Don't just try to think about it in your head, because it can go in, one side and out the other very quickly, and you'll wake up and you won't remember. So writing it down, whether it's on a piece of paper or a journal, doesn't need to be anything fancy. That'll be really helpful. But anyway, yes, please go ahead and do that. You can find, a summary of that daily deed and the other daily deeds that we have designed to help you become better men, in this case, more prudent men. Thank you again for listening. Please go and be prudent men, be virtuous men, and continue on the path to becoming more complete men, so we can make our families, our communities, a much better place. And always remember that virtue makes the man. Good night.